Dr. Stanley I. Wolf, and I'm a physician, and my rank was at the Chosin Reservoir was Lieutenant JG in the U.S. Navy Reserve. And my first combat in North Korea was a town called Sudong, and Sudong is south of the Chosin Reservoir, and that's our first contact with the Chinese. And the Chinese, they notified General MacArthur, who was in charge in Japan, that the Chinese were in the war, and they said, oh no, they're not in, they wouldn't dare come in against the Americans. Those are volunteers, and don't be afraid of them. They're just like, there's a General Almond, who apparently had quite a good military record during World War II, and he was the adjutant or for General MacArthur, and he characterized the Chinese as laundrymen. Don't worry, you're not afraid of laundrymen. Well, they were very good fighters, and they had been fighting, the communist troops had been fighting the nationalist troops, and the Chinese communists had won and taken over and amalgamated all those troops. And in any event, we met them at Sudong, and it's interesting, there was a picture on the front page of the Washington Star newspaper of myself and several of my corpsmen dressing the wounds of a Chinese soldier on the hood of a Jeep, and the narrative on the newspaper was a Washington medic in North Korea, and there was my picture, and my folks had it all enlarged and everything. And in any event, we moved up from Sudong. That was our first contact with the Chinese, and the historical record is the Chinese were just testing us, and then they pulled back. And this was the 4th of November 1950, and the weather was still relatively warm. And they moved up and moved into a place called Coterie, with units at the Marine Division, and then up to Hagaruri, which is where I was stationed, and Hagaruri became the headquarters for the 1st Marine Division at that time. And this is a town just on the south end of the Chosin Reservoir, and that's a large lake-like reservoir, hydroelectric power. So they had a network of lakes up there, and the Chosin Reservoir, that's a Japanese name for it, which stuck with the Koreans called it the Changjin Reservoir. In any event, they put us in an aid station. Half of our battalion moved on up to a town called Udamni, which was on the Yalu River, which was just at the Chinese border. And half of our battalion was still in Hagaru when the Chinese came in and cut off the road and with the roadblocks, and the rest of our battalion we were scheduled to move on up to all the way up to Udamni, and we were unable to get there. So our companies were, as a matter of fact, there was a 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines Company, D Company was held on to this pass, which was able to hold out for 4 days, and several Medal of Honor were given to the General Davis and other troops that were able to conquer that. But in any event, at Hagaru, we had our casualties from troops fighting in and around Hagaru, defending that position. And east of Chosin was the Army had placed 31st and 33rd Infantry Regiments of the 7th Army, and they had relieved the 7th Marines, who had been there east of Chosin first, and they had moved up then west of the Chosin Reservoir north to Udamni, leaving these Army units there with 10 miles north of Hagaru over a winding single-lane dirt road with no hope of resupply, and it was really just stuck them there as if to show that we were occupying North Korea. and they never dreamt that the Chinese would dare come in. And these units fought, but they were overwhelmed by the Chinese. And they had wounded on trucks. The Chinese shot the drivers of the trucks, and if one was blocking the highway, the others couldn't get through. And the Chinese took their time using the wounded as target practice. So any of the wounded who were able got off the trucks, because it was obvious if they stayed they'd be killed. And they got on the ice, and they said the Marines are 20 miles that way. If you can get there, then they'll take care of you. And here they had hundreds of wounded out on the ice trying to get to where we were at Hagaroo, and many of them were on the ice for 3 and 4 days. And what happened, there were the Air Force, Marine, and Air Force planes spotted these troops, had these wounded troops out on the ice, and the Marine major or colonel, I'm blocking on his name, but he organized a tank infantry group to go up on the ice. They took jeeps up on the ice. It was frozen. It was 40 below zero, keep in mind. And they swept the ice, brought these wounded, and some of them they took right to, they had a small airfield they had scratched out at Hagaroo, and they had planes, propeller planes that came in that could take 28 stretcher cases and 32 seated back to Japan. And they would come in, and some of the wounded were so bad they took them right to the airplane and took them. Others they delivered to Air Aid Station, and we weren't aware of other medical facilities, but obviously there were other medical facilities. But we had several hundred that were brought to us. We had to set up separate tents to put them in with a little pot-bellied stove for warmth. And we had these frozen, not frostbite, frozen soldiers in our aid station, and we had to, we had been treating them. We'll talk about the equipment that we had that contributed to the casualties, but the Army units that we had coming in, multiple gunshot wounds. As they thawed out, they would start to bleed, and in this case, maybe the cold weather had saved their lives because they were freezing, but they start to bleed, and they the problem was, usually in a military situation, you can evacuate to the rear, and if we couldn't take care of us, suture up a wound or get the shrapnel out or something like that, or splint them if they had a sprain, patch them up for a couple of days, we would move them back to a regimental collecting company, which is behind the line, or to further back to what they call a MASH unit, which event, that's where they would go, and they could do that. But we were surrounded by 125,000 Chinese, and there was no way to evacuate them except by plane. And we had orders that anybody who could ride shotgun, that means to the side of the driver, even if he couldn't walk, he could not be evacuated. And as a result, we had to keep guys in the line, to keep guys at our aid station who couldn't walk, but they could stop a bullet, and they had to stay. And could they have been evacuated, maybe they would have saved their feet or maybe saved their lives. But the problem we had with so many casualties was that some of them, let's say you had a kid with half his head shot away, and we have another one with a sucking chest wound, and this kid with a sucking chest wound, if they could get to Japan, they could take care of that and block that off and save their life. This kid, we didn't know whether he could be saved or not, so we kept him, and we sent this one. And I've lived with that all my life, that had this kid gotten out, he might have been saved too. But we made decisions, and I was fortunate enough to have another doctor with me in the aid station who had been in World War II, and after he got out back, he was a board-eligible urologist. He was a surgeon, should not have been in an Italian aid station. He should have been in a hospital company. But I had his surgical judgment to help make those decisions, which I was very grateful for that. As far as the Marines would go, we had multiple gunshot and shrapnel wounds. The problem was operating at 20, 30, 40 below zero. They didn't know about wind chill factor at that time, so the wind chill factor may have been 60 or 70 below zero, it's estimated. but the corpsmen, who were the bravest of the brave, they'd have to take their gloves off to take care of wounded, so they would have frostbite. They would, syringes of morphine froze, they'd put them in their mouth to have to thaw them out to get them to use that. And we had plasma. You know, after World War II, they had demobilized, and they didn't have it. We had plasma dated 1947, and we called up and said, we need some fresh plasma. That's all you got, use it. So a lot of guys got plasma in 1947, and as far as we know, it worked. So, but that had to be thawed out also. It couldn't be used otherwise. But they had given us equipment called a shoe pack. And a shoe pack boot was well thought out. Whoever thought of this was thought to be a genius, I guess, but the man had a 3/4 inch felt inner sole which would absorb perspiration. At night he would take his boot off, take this inner sole, put it next to his body so the body heat would evaporate his perspiration, take the warm, dry one, put it back in the boot, powder his feet, put on warm, dry socks, and go forth to liberate the world. Well, these guys, many of the troops they had, not many, but some were bayoneted in their sleeping bags. So the word got around about that. They would not get into sleeping bags anymore, so they used a sleeping bag like a blanket, and they would not, at 20 below zero, take their boots off. The inner sole stayed in for 3 or 4 days, and it froze. So they had a layer of ice under their feet. If they took their boot off, they couldn't get it back on again. Their feet swelled, and it was like raw meat. And they would come hopping into the aid station on one foot because they couldn't walk on the other foot, and we would take their boots off gingerly, because if you took it off too fast, their toes came with it. And anyway, they had raw meat. It was like bleeding their feet, and we could not evacuate these guys. We had orders that even though they couldn't walk, they wouldn't take a place on these planes, because we had so many wounded, including the Army units, needing the space on the planes, and these were desperately injured people. So this was the experience I had at the Chosin Reservoir. And then we marched from Hagaruri back, and every Jeep space was taken with a wounded person, so I walked with the Marines just like everybody else, and subject to the same cold weather, and my feet had blisters on them too with the cold weather, and I'm 80% disabled from the effects of the long-term effects of cold injury, which that's another story. We had trouble getting the veterans to recognize the long-term effects of cold injury, even though the Army did all the research on it. There's one branch of the Army of the government doesn't talk to another. Anyway, we got back to Hungnam, got on board ships, and we were a grungy group of guys, I have to tell you, they got back to Busan in South Korea, and at that point I was transferred back to collecting to a D medical company.